This is Get Uncomfortable, the podcast where we talk race, politics, religion, and all the things with me, Adam Smith. Cannabis and hemp have long been used for textiles, medicine, and so much more. As recent as the 1960s, marijuana was targeted for political and economic gain by criminalizing what it was then deemed a drug to criminalize the users, many of whom were Black, brown, and hippies protesting the government and the war in Vietnam. Millions of people and their families have been detrimentally impacted by these efforts that were grounded in white supremacy, capitalism, and anti-Blackness. Just Say No, the war on drugs, and 3 Strikes You're Out have devastated families and communities, while the prescription drug and alcohol industries have flourished. Today, legalization of recreational medical marijuana are growing from state to state. One newbie to legalization and decriminalization family is Minnesota, who legalized recreational marijuana and decriminalized cannabis convictions beginning in August of 2023. The land of 10,000 lakes is hoping to learn from others who legalize by ensuring that those most impacted by the racist criminalization now benefit from this new economy. The rollout feels intentional and purposeful in what is hoped to be a model system that lifts the communities while giving all Minnesotans access to cannabis as safe alternatives to many prescriptive and other more dangerous legal drugs. In this episode, we're joined by Marcus Harkis. Marcus Harkis is a family man, writer, organizer, justice and equity advocate, and traveler from North Minneapolis, Minnesota. Marcus has been a cannabis consumer for the past 25 years, a survival of excessive racial profiling, police brutality with post-traumatic resilience, not PSD, in large part thanks to this healing plant. He has advocated and lobbied for the full legalization of cannabis since 2014 and feels relieved that Minnesota's legislature and governor finally changed the prohibition laws in this past legislative session. Marcus served as executive director for MinNormal and the Minnesota Campaign for Full Legalization. He's co-founder and board trustee of the Minnesota Cannabis College, and he's a board member of Big Psych, a local psychedelic education activist organization which advocates for decriminalization and of entheogens like sacred mushrooms. Marcus is currently doing business planning and will raise investment capital to launch his own cannabis business when licenses become available late next year. Marcus, thank you so much for sharing community with us today. Let's get uncomfortable, man.
Thank you. Let's go.
Marcus, can you talk a little bit about your work, first and foremost, that you've been doing around the country in Minnesota, kind of as a level set? We read your bio, but I mean, tell us the real. Tell us about your work, what centers you, what motivates you, really what grounds you in the...
So I'm from North Minneapolis. I'm a community organizer. I'm a writer. I've been a nonprofit advocate for 20 years. I'm a lobbyist. I'm a social entrepreneur. And all of my work has been related to justice and equity. So, like when I hear people call themselves progressive, especially like Democrats, political Democrats, I laugh because I don't think most people are very progressive. You know, most people just think about their personal self-interest. And I do too. I think a lot about my personal interest, but I'm a person who cares about improving society, improving the community, particularly for the most vulnerable. So that's the type of man I am. I've been trying to work to improve society for the disadvantaged and the disenfranchised. Yeah. So I've worked on a wide variety of issues, community development, youth development, education policy, housing policy, workforce policy. And for the past 9 years, I've focused a lot on drug policy reform.
I love it. I love it. Can you talk about, so level set for us, the difference between legalization, because we have a couple different terms. We have a term prohibition, right? And criminalization. We also have a term legalization and decriminalization. So can you level set in your mind, right? What do those terms mean? How do those terms differ from each other?
Legalization means that it's not against the law to, within the context of cannabis, to cultivate it, to purchase it, to buy and sell it, to possess it and consume it. Whereas decriminalization, within the context of Minnesota, is where I live, where I'm from. The state of Minnesota decriminalized cannabis in small amounts in 1976, before I was born. But this didn't mean that the police wouldn't give you a hard time. It just meant that if you had less than 42.5 grams, which is about an ounce and a half, that it's only a petty misdemeanor. So you can still get a ticket, you can still get harassed. Yeah, decriminalization just means that the criminal penalties are not as harsh as something that is, like in Minnesota before this summer, if you had more than 42.5 grams of flower, cannabis flower, you can get a felony for that. But if you had less than 42.5 grams, which is about an ounce and a half, it would be treated as a petty misdemeanor. You could still get a hard time. You can still get a ticket. You can still be harassed, but you wouldn't be arrested. So that's an example of decriminalization. Well, it's not legalization. So as of August 1st, Minnesotans can now possess up to 2 ounces of cannabis in the flower form, the bud, and up to 800 milligrams in edibles, and up to 8 grams of concentrate. And these are all arbitrary numbers. It's all dumb. There shouldn't be any prohibition on any amount. You shouldn't be able to be criminalized if you have more than 2 ounces. But we consider this progress, and it does make a lot of people more safe, from the threat of criminalization. And we're also allowed to grow at home for personal use. Right now, you can grow up to 8 plants as long as only 4 of them are flowering, which means, they have the actual bud on them growing. So you can have 8 plants, but only 4 of them can be flowering at a time. Right now, we're waiting on the state to stand up an organization, the state agency, a new one called the Office of Cannabis Management. This will be the organization that regulates the legal cannabis industry. So they're right now trying to hire a director. They're going to hire like 150 people. Then they'll go through a process of rulemaking. So there's laws, but then we didn't want the state to create all the rules for the industry because, legislators don't really know what they're doing. And they would certainly ruin the industry if they made all the rules through legislation, which they're just not capable of doing that well. So the Office of Cannabis Management will create the rules for the industry. And then hopefully by this time next year, about a year from now, they'll come out with licenses for legal cannabis businesses. And so we'll probably see dispensaries opening up by early 2025. And in terms of expungements, the new laws say that if you have a misdemeanor or a petty misdemeanor for cannabis, that they'll be automatically expunged. This is not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen by the end of this year, but it will happen probably within a year or so. But for the 200, and there's like 66,000, almost 70,000 people who have either misdemeanors or petty misdemeanors for cannabis in Minnesota. But there are 230,000 Minnesotans who have felonies for cannabis. And their felonies will not be automatically expunged. The state will create what they're called the Cannabis Expungement Board, which will be a small group of people who will review all of the 230,000 people who like go to them. That part is not automatic. The people with the felonies have to present their case to the Cannabis Expungement Board, which is going to be a short-lived thing. It's only going to operate for like a year or two, according to the legislation. And so not everybody with a cannabis felony will probably even know that they have that opportunity. And I definitely don't think everybody with a cannabis felony will get their record expunged, but they do have the opportunity to be considered for that, which is kind of a big deal, but it's definitely a flawed process.
Yeah, man. Well, and the parts of it that are so interesting are that, you know, it's crazy that we're talking flower, and because I'm going to say, you know, if the criminalization and the roots are whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony, we know what criminalization of cannabis has done to communities. You know, then I'm on paper, then I go to jail. Then I go to jail, but because I don't have resources to be able to get an attorney, then I gotta take, a public defender who helps me plea it down. So now I'm dealing with that, but then I have a record. And so then I'm involved in the system, and it's just never ending. So we can go ahead, whether it's the felony, and you're right, the challenge is going to be on the felonies. The people that don't know or don't have the resources or don't have the wherewithal, whatever that may be, to go in front of this board. But at the same time, are you gonna also look at expunging all of the felonies that are a result of criminalizing something that you did strictly to disenfranchise, disempower Black, brown folks? Can you talk a little bit historically, because I know you have some scholarship to you. Can you talk a little bit about the history in America about criminalizing cannabis and even psychedelics, like you're talking about, and the harm that criminalization has intentionally, I would say, caused Black and brown communities?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So most people don't know about the history of prohibition. I mean, people, when they think about the drug war, they start with Richard Nixon's administration. But there was a time when alcohol was prohibited in this country. It only lasted like 12 years. But in the wake of the repeal of alcohol prohibition in the early 30s, I think it was like 1933, 34, the people who worked in the government to try to enforce alcohol prohibition, some of them thought they needed some other work to do. So around that same time when alcohol was repealed, there were people who started a campaign to prohibit cannabis. There was a time in the late 1800s, early 1900s where cannabis was a common ingredient in like 28 different medications, pharmaceutical medications. So it's not like people in this society were unaware of cannabis. But there was a guy named Harry Anslinger who had he formed what was called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was the precursor to the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. And in 1937, there was this act in Congress called the Marijuana Tax Stamp Act, which prohibited cannabis. That's where it began, 1937. So the campaign to make cannabis illegal then, they called it marijuana, like marijuana, to make it sound Mexican. And these people were using Black people and Mexican as the boogeyman to scare white legislators or other interests to get their support in advocating for the prohibition by saying this is a drug used by Mexican migrant workers and Black jazz players. So they used a bunch of pseudoscience. They even came out with a big movie at the time called Reefer Madness. That's where that term comes from, a movie by the same name. That was it was ridiculous. Like they were saying that smoking marijuana will make you kill your brother or, go insane and just jump out a window and kill yourself. So it was all based on a bunch of lies, a bunch of pseudoscience, a bunch of racism. And, fast forward to 1970, 69, 70, the former President Richard Nixon formed what was called the Schaefer Commission. And these people were made up, that commission was made up largely of prohibitionists, like law enforcement, politician type people. And they came back with a study that said, no, cannabis, or what they call marijuana, should not be made illegal. It's relatively harmless. But Richard Nixon defied his own Schaefer Commission, and they declared the war on drugs as a way to distract from like the failures of the Vietnam War, and just for political reasons. This was like towards the end of the civil rights movement, and so they used the drug war as a way to like punish Black people and like the anti-war left, hippie type people. So that's when they came out with the drug schedule. People have heard of Schedule 1, that's when they came out with that bogus, categorization of different drugs. And they listed cannabis, what they call marijuana, as a Schedule 1 drug, which means that there's no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, which, as we know now, is completely bogus. But the drug war kicked off in the early 70s, and it led to mass incarceration, which, just increased from the 70s to the 80s and the 90s. That's when, we saw mass incarceration at its peak. Then 1994, they did the federal crime bill. So the drug war has been a tool used to harass marginalized communities, disproportionately Black or brown or Native and poor white communities. And cannabis, it's way more commonly used than drugs like heroin or meth or these other things. So cannabis has always been a low-hanging fruit. It's an easy thing to find because you can smell it easily. Because, after alcohol and tobacco, cannabis is the third most popular, what they call illicit drug. So, yeah, it's been a tool that police use to harass people, and I've been a victim of it. They were arresting thousands and thousands of people. Just in Minnesota alone, they've arrested tens of millions of people over cannabis over the years, just since the 70s.
Shout out to the great literary work Slavery by Any Other Name. And the realities is it's criminalizing, but it's also a way to institutionalize and prop up systems like the new Jim Crow that Michelle Alexander talks about in her book and her writing. Marcus, one of the things is, bro, I know you have national connections, and I know Minnesota is not the first, right? But hopefully Minnesota is going to learn from some of the lessons in California and Washington and Colorado and these other municipalities. So talk a little bit about your national connections and what have you heard from people in states where legalization has happened? And what are some of the things you hope Minnesota learns from some of those lessons to do it differently the Minnesota way?
Yeah, so between the summer of 2015 through winter of 2016, so about a year and a half, or 2014 to 2016, I was the director of Minnesota NORML, which is a state affiliate of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. So it was through that job that I had this luxury of time to even learn this history of prohibition and to learn how other states were, coming forward with legalization. Because I've been a consumer for the past 25 years, but I didn't even think this was the issue to work on until Colorado and Washington State, implemented their adult use cannabis markets in 2014. So, and that's the year when I had a friend at the time, we're no longer friends, but he got me involved with Minnesota NORML, and that's how I eventually got my job there. But I started meeting people from other states who are involved with this, movement for legalization. And so we have been able to benefit from those lessons. Minnesota became the 23rd state to legalize it for adult personal use. And you might notice that I don't use a lot of the common terms. I don't use the term marijuana. I don't say recreational marijuana. And I'm not knocking people who do, but those are terms that are often derived by prohibitionists or and racists. But anyway, so I learned that in a lot of states, they allowed local municipalities, city governments to ban cannabis businesses. So like if you go into California, which was the first state that legalized what they call medical cannabis in 1996, they legalized adult use just a few years ago, but they allowed cities, and they didn't do it through the legislature. Most states haven't legalized it through the legislature. They did it through a ballot referendum, but Minnesota doesn't have that type of system. That's why we couldn't do it that way. But California's model of for legalization, it allows cities to ban it. So you might be driving through a conservative part of California. You could go for like 900 miles and there's no legal cannabis businesses allowed. So if part of the reason is to legalize cannabis to replace the legacy market, you're not going to do that if you have wide swaths of the state where people who want to do it legally don't have a chance because it's banned. So it's kind of legalish in every state. We use the term for legalization, but it's just legalish, really.
I know a lot of ish folks.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the pieces that I've heard, now I'm not in the city, so I need this is your work. One of the things that I've heard that the hopes with the commission is going to do, that there are some commitments to ensure that licenses are given not only to the big corporate cannabis entities and the big machine cannabis entities, but the co-ops and the local folks. And so ensuring that there's a percentage of Minnesota grown, even today, right? When you have, what can you buy, 10 milligrams a piece in edibles or something like that before, right, August? So talk a little bit about how Minnesota and the commission is ensuring that the people most harmed historically from cannabis criminalization and prohibition, right, are the same ones that can benefit from this new economy.
Cool. So there's this term called vertical integration, which means within the context of cannabis or any industry, that you can completely control the supply chain. So you can be within cannabis, a cultivator. You can manufacture the products, like make edibles or concentrates from the flower you grow, and you can have retail stores. In Minnesota, we limit the amount of vertical integration anybody can have. And so there are 16 different license types. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to create as much opportunity as possible. So the only way to be like vertically integrated to the furthest extent that we allow in Minnesota is to have a micro license or a meso license. And for instance, with the micro license, you can have your grow out, but it's limited to 5,000 square feet of canopy. You can have a manufacturing license. But with a micro license, you only get to have one store. With the meso license, you can do similar things. You can have a grow, you can have a manufacturing facility, but you can have 3 retail stores. If somebody wants to get a retail only license, they're limited to 5 stores, but then they're not able to manufacture or grow. And so they also have a license type called a bulk manufacturer or a bulk cultivator. I mean, even the scale of that is limited. Like for instance, with the grow, if you're a bulk cultivator, you can have up to 30,000 square feet of canopy, but then you're not allowed to have a retail license, or a manufacturing license. So we limit the extent that anybody can control too much of the market in terms of being a licensee. So I think that's better. I mean, it's still going to advantage people who have a lot of money, but nobody's going to be able to own like 24 stores like the Green Solution chain in Colorado had. So it creates more opportunity. And the micro enterprise license is only like $750. So it doesn't limit how much you can sell in your one store, but it creates a lower barrier to entry for people who have less resources.
Can you talk a little bit about, because you know this backwards and forwards. So in Minnesota, who fought for legalization and who were the people, the principalities and powers, we would say in scripture, who were the folks that fought against you? So who made, and again, you can't climb inside somebody's head and their body, but really what is really the why, right?
Yeah, that's always, I think, one of the most important questions. One of the best ones to start with. Well, for the people who were for it, it was largely a bunch of consumers. I mean, there were older people who've been involved with this since the 70s or the 80s with organizations like NORML. I mean, there's some people who are involved with Marijuana Policy Project, but more of the grassroots people were with NORML. There was, there's people who want to get in the industry who've been involved. And those people came around later when it seemed like, oh, it's about to happen. It was more like the grassroots activists, social justice type activists, or civil liberty type people who were in it for the long term. In the last several years, it was mostly people, or a lot of people who were trying to position themselves to get in the industry, as entrepreneurs. There were some social justice people who were not necessarily consumers, but those are organizations like American Civil Liberties Union, stuff like that. But most of the people who fought the hardest and longest were consumers, and a lot of them were either victims of prohibition themselves or knew and loved people who were. And then in terms of people who fought against it, it's primarily been law enforcement lobbies, and I can name them in Minnesota. It's the Minnesota Police Chiefs Association, the Minnesota Sheriff's Association, the Minnesota Peace Officers Association, and until a couple of years ago, the Minnesota County Attorneys Association. They decided to be neutral on this a couple of years ago, which is kind of a big deal. It's better than being opposed to it. And then it was the treatment industry interest, Drug treatment is a big business for some organizations. So when you got a drug like cannabis, which is so prevalent, and it's easy for people to get criminalized and then be forced into treatment, even if they don't need it, the interests within the treatment industry that profit from that were fighting against legalization. And then in the end, they also find other more conservative interests, including the Catholic Church. I thought that was interesting that they got involved in the last couple of years. And then they found the treatment and law enforcement people in this last year, they were able to form a coalition. It's like Minnesotans Against Legalization or something. You could have called them Minnesotans for Prohibition, but they won't admit that. And a lot of those are like more conservative industries that may already like prohibit smoking, like the Truckers Association or something. So yeah, and then they sometimes will get people who had children who died from like drunk driving or fentanyl, and they'll use these parents who are so traumatized about the loss of their children that they bring them in to tell their I don't want to call them sob stories, like I'm dismissing them because it's real and I feel for them, but they'll bring these people in, put on a performance, crying and shit, and they'll blame cannabis, and cannabis is not to blame. So
it goes
you see a lot of political theater. It's ridiculous.
What we call drugs and what we don't, right? Like I said, I live in Kentucky. Yeah. 95% of the world's bourbon is made within the Commonwealth of Kentucky. It is an entire industry, right? It isn't just the Kentucky Derby. It's the Woodford Reserve Kentucky Derby, right? Okay, what's up the road from my house? Like Woodford is a county where Woodford Reserve is made, right? And it borders Fayette County where I live. So we criminalize the people in some drugs, and then we decriminalize other people. I have a 78-year-old mother who spent her entire life in Hopkins, St. Louis Park, over north, and she has such bad arthritis. She is on oxycodone, OxyContin, all the things, and still suffering in pain. I am hoping for the day where she can use cannabis as a way to deal with the pain, because at this point, all of the medication she's taking is basically making her kidneys shut down. And all she would need, right, is not just cannabis, but cannabis differently prescribed by, not prescribed, but somebody who knows what they're doing. Okay, take this. This is the kind of edible, this salve, use this on your neck because you have a spinal fusion all the way through and you have all this pain. And then the mentals that go along with the pain that she deals with. And we've had to even talk to her doctors in the pain clinics about, they're all worried she's going to become an OxyContin addict and become, a heroin addict. Well, she's 78 at this point. But I would much rather have her, and I have friends who've lived in states where it's prohibition, and they have literally moved states as stage 3 cancer fighters because they feel like they know and believe that cannabis is their medicine, and the other medicines that they're giving them are killing them. Right? So talk a little bit about your lived experience and how you feel, like honestly, because you've been real honest, bro. Talk a little bit about how your experience is telling you, and how do you feel like the rollout of this is going in Minnesota?
Well, it's kind of started off in a very bad way, which is not surprising. But the Office of Cannabis Management, whoever is chosen as the founding leadership, they're going to set the tone. They're going to create the organizational culture for this agency that regulates the industry. These are the people who are going to create the initial rules for the industry. So it's imperative to get the right people in there. And they announced the first director like a couple weeks ago. And the governor made a terrible, stupid choice. And this woman ended up resigning like 26 hours later because, the internet went crazy. But they had the opportunity to hire, and I'm biased. I always admit if I'm biased, but I also don't exaggerate. They had the opportunity of a lifetime to hire this young Black guy, Clement Dabney III. We call him Dr. Dabs. He has plenty of industry experience. He can formulate any product. This guy has a PhD in cannabis genetics and genomics, a master's in plant molecular biology. Like, this guy would have been the best director that you could have hired in any state. I mean, he doesn't have experience leading a public institution. He doesn't have bureaucratic experience, but they chose, and no offense to associate's degrees, they chose this white lady from the suburbs. No offense to people in the suburbs or white ladies, but they chose this white lady with an associate's degree over my friend who's got a PhD in cannabis and who has like at least 6 years in the industry. And he understands all the racial dynamics in terms of prohibition and the imperatives for making this an equitable, diverse legal industry. So they passed him up for this lady who was not qualified. And she didn't even last 28 hours. So that to me is a massive red flag. And it's like, now they're so embarrassed by it. The governor was like, oh, we're going to have to find somebody who just has a bunch of experience regulating. And the thing is, if you have somebody who's a seasoned regulator but doesn't know anything about cannabis in terms of the science or the industry, like, they're going to have a much steeper learning curve than if they would have hired Dr. Dabs and then allowed him to hire, other leadership that could compensate for his lack of bureaucratic experience. So, whenever you have politicians making decisions like this for an industry, like it's really risky, and the odds of them making bad choices in the leadership are high when it, because the governor gets to appoint the first director, and right out the gate he messed up in a terrible way. So I do still think Minnesota will have one of the best markets. There's advantages to going later, but it all depends on what kind of leadership they get in there.
Yeah.
And I'm not that confident. I think it'll be okay, but it could be way better if they chose the right people. If they actually care about racial equity and justice, they don't, though. They'll use those talking points when it comes to passing a bill to end the criminalization, but they're not going to use those talking points when it comes to, repairing those disproportionately Black victims of prohibition in terms of helping them to cross over from the legacy market to the legal market.
Well, and race blind for so many other things. The Twin Cities, people forget that outside of the Twin Cities, it politically is no different from North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, right? Those places. And one of the more scary things, though, oftentimes are liberals that are not people of color, that oftentimes when they're called on their biases or their, challenges or their behaviors, then become vicious, right? Well, you're just as in the bag, right? Progressive. The D's are as much as the R's, right? There's no good guys, bad guys, right? How you talked a little bit about imperatives. How do we ensure, how do you, because this is your work, not just the cannabis piece, but the justice work, the abolition work. How do the people ensure that the people are centered in the commission, but also in what they're calling potentially $1.5 billion market in Minnesota? How do you and the community and the people, because in Minnesota, that is a difference. I've lived in a whole bunch of states, and Minnesota is different as far as the people go, because the people don't all look brown, right? The people are all different. How do the people ensure that the commission is representative of the people, that has an idea, and it isn't just a bunch of political appointees that have done favors or paid for dinners? And how do the people also ensure that the communities benefit from those dollars that are going to come into the state, which they're guessing is about $1.5 billion?
I mean, most of those dollars are going to the businesses that make the money. The tax revenue is probably going to be a few $100 million, which is really just a drop in the bucket if you look at, Minnesota's state budget. But during the legislative session, we were trying to make it part of the law that the governor would be required to consult with, a board of people from the community, real stakeholders, to advise him on who to select as the founding director of the OCM. But, they removed that during the conference committee process in the end. And the governor had no interest in consulting with stakeholders on who to select for those leadership roles. So the reality is we don't really have much influence in who he chooses for that. I mean, I will say that if people do want to influence the decision makers, they have to holler at them. They have to advocate. They have to build these relationships. So, like, I'm personally planning on reaching out to the interim director, which sadly, she was one of the people that probably recommended that first director who didn't pan out. So, I mean, the only way we can create make this market people-centered is to get enough people in the industry who are people-centered themselves and operate businesses in a way that, that values community, that values wellness, that values justice. I mean, the reality is when it comes to business, they're always going to prioritize profit over people. So I think it's a must for people within the cannabis space who care about community and wellness or justice. They have to be conscious consumers themselves or conscious entrepreneurs. You know, if people go support, if they don't support the businesses that actually have those values, it's going to be hard for those businesses to stay in business, to survive. So it's really on the consumers and the entrepreneurs to make the market what they want it to be.
Bro, thank you again for sharing the time and all of the knowledge. I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to this episode of Get Uncomfortable. Get Uncomfortable is produced in partnership between me, Rachel Hansen, and Adam Smith. If you want to hear more from Adam, visit his website, hearadamspeak.com, where you can book him to speak at your organization and hear more about what he has to say about what we talk about here on the show. Now, if you want to support the show itself, there are a variety of ways that you can do that. You can leave us a review anywhere you listen to podcasts, send us an email, or share an episode with a friend. Until next time, stay uncomfortable.